Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I'd like to talk about paraphrasing. And in particular, paraphrasing when two people are talking where they don't agree. The context for this is a friend of mine, Andrew Stratelites, has talked about on Twitter the old medieval practice of before you argue with somebody, or when arguing with somebody, before you start to show how his position is wrong, you have to first state his position to his satisfaction, and only in your own words. And only once you have restated his position to his satisfaction may you then go and start to explain why his position is wrong. Now, the reason for this is because people very often misunderstand each other, and often misunderstand each other especially about complex subjects, and especially about complex subjects that they do not agree about. So, in order to avoid essentially attacking a straw man inadvertently, instead of attacking the position first, you have to first state the position, and then the other person listens to it and can say, no, you got that wrong, no, you got that wrong, that's not really it at all, you're missing out on this thing, and then you go back and forth until such time as you can, in your own words, state his position, and he says, yes, now you understand what it is I'm saying. At that point, you can proceed because you now clearly understand what his position is, and whatever attacks you have to bring against this position, it will be attacks against his position. Now, the reason why this is so important, by the way, why this is so effective for making sure you actually understand the other person's position, is because comprehension and generation are two very different things. In comprehension, we all do to some degree what you can see especially clearly that children do. If you ever really take the time to figure out what children understood from what they heard, what you'll find out is that they pick out bits and pieces. They'll recognize a word, they'll recognize another word, see them kind of in order, and hope that the meaning was related to the words they actually understood, and that the other words they don't understand didn't really modify things too much. Not on a conscious level, by the way. They're not like thinking this through in those words, but like that's kind of what they do. And so it's you can get them to say things that are utterly contradictory to what they want, or get them to agree to things that are utterly contradictory to what they want because they'll hear it. So like, 2-year-olds really great at this. And, the 2-year-old will say, pick me up, with fewer words. Up is, 2-year-old will say. And then you look down and say, I'm too tired. I'm not feeling, I'm not feeling energetic enough to pick you up. And then the child will nod their head and say, yes, up, because they heard the word up. So clearly, you understood what they meant. Well, of course, they didn't understand what you meant. It's a good example. You can see a similar thing also in people who are starting to learn a foreign language, where they pick out, there's some words that they recognize and most words they don't, and they sort of pick it out. All of these things highlight how comprehension is, you hear a bunch of words and you figure you know what this means because there's always, imperfections in communication. It's really easy to think you have the gist when in fact you could utterly miss things like, I don't have the energy to pick you up, and the child hears, pick you up. And they go, yes, that's what I want. Well, the meaning was completely reversed there. So this is why it's the medieval rule, which is often a good idea, is to state things in your own words, because when you go to generate it, you will yourself pick out, what you think is important. You will concentrate on what you think is important. If you got wrong what was important, if you are reversing the sense of it or missing out on a large chunk of it or something, you will naturally, as you put together the words, leave those things out or have the different sense or so on. And then the other person who knows what he means and hears this thing that's very far off can then say, no, that's really, really wrong. That's really off, or you're missing a big chunk. And it's the fact that you yourself are generating it which enables that communication to really go effectively. And in practice, this often will take a bunch of back and forth because, you might not have been nearly as far off as it sounded like, and then you work into some details and you hammer out the details and come to an agreement on the details in a way where you can say it such that you both understand it to mean the same thing. And that process of hammering out the details between the two people is often extremely important. That's where a lot of the communication actually ends up taking place, where the two of each, where both of you learn about the other. It is time consuming, however, and a lot of people don't really have time for this. So there are several different reasons people really end up disliking this. The first one I want to focus on, though, is that there is another form of paraphrasing made famous recently in a conversation, not made famous, but anyway, a very recently famous example of this was the conversation between Jordan Peterson and I believe her name was Kathy Newman from some Canadian Channel 4, in which she apparently, I didn't actually see the thing, but I mean, I don't know how you could live on the internet and not see a large number of memes about this thing. Anyway, what apparently happened was that Jordan would say something, and then Kathy would say, so what you're really saying is, and then something that was utterly unrelated to what he said, or tangentially related to what he said, and very often the opposite of what he said. So he would say something about, educating children is important. She would say something to the effect of, so what you're really saying is that we need to kill as many children as possible so that we don't have to feed them. And he would say, no, that's not what I meant at all. Again, I'm making up the example. I didn't see it, but it's the last in a famous example in a long line of this sort of thing. It was just apparently especially blatant here. What she was doing, and what people do often do, is some variant of what you could call aggressive paraphrasing, or vicious paraphrasing, or paraphrasing in bad faith. It's not entirely clear that that's what was going on, by the way, from the few snippets that I saw. And in a lot of cases, what looks like it is aggressive paraphrasing is not so much aggressive paraphrasing as attempting, as massively misunderstanding the person, thinking of the person as having a very different position than they in fact have, and then paraphrasing what they said to what you think their position is in clear language. So, in this case, that from what I understand, Kathy Newman thought that Jordan Peterson was, roughly speaking, some sort of Nazi monster. And again, didn't see it. The specifics don't really matter. And so when he would say something, she would try to figure out something that is relatively plain English that a Nazi monster would say that was on the same topic as what Jordan Peterson had just been saying. Now, there's the question, did she know that he isn't a Nazi monster? Well, that's between her and God, frankly. The relevant part, though, is that this sort of antagonistic paraphrasing, it's probably actually the better term for it, antagonistic paraphrasing, is the opposite of the medieval style, because she was not seeking to understand his position. She was seeking to bring his position out into a way where it could be most easily attacked. In a sense, what she was trying to do is rebuild his position as, in straw. Although she may well not have thought she was making a completely unrelated position, just that he's kind of hemming and hawing and trying not to let the full awfulness of his position be visible, and she's trying to draw the full awfulness of his position out. You'll see a very similar thing, by the way, if you look at atheists trying to interpret the Bible, and if they're talking with Christians especially, you'll see this where the atheist thinks like, oh, you're just trying to hide how awful this is, and I'm just trying to state in plain language how awful this is, and the Christian looking at this is going, what drugs are you on that you're taking this passage to mean this utterly different thing? So you get a similar sort of thing, and for all those who, well, especially for anyone on the atheist position who really thinks ill of Kathy Newman, just bear in mind that you often look like this to Christians if you're talking about anything that's actually related to Christianity. The amount of astonishing misunderstanding and utter, whether advertent or inadvertent, misrepresentation of Christian doctrine is pretty impressive. And again, in defense of the atheists who do this, where I think many of them are not, in fact, attempting to be liars, many of them, I think, have a lot of experience with, or what experience they do have is with the heretics known as Christian fundamentalists, who have some pretty awful doctrines. But it's not that Orthodox Christians have the same doctrines, we just try to pretty it up, we really seriously reject as heretics many of the doctrines of fundamentalist Christianity. They're really, really catastrophically wrong about a lot of things, and we don't have the same thing but pretty it up. We think they're very, very wrong. So anyhow, that's an example of where I think many of the people who do it aren't trying to trap people in a completely dishonest way. They just sort of end up doing it because of very different experiences, very different approaches, and very different backgrounds, and so on, and some pretty severe ignorance of what the other person's position actually is. So that's antagonistic paraphrasing. But the thing that makes antagonistic paraphrasing so bad is the fact that it's antagonistic, that it is not really in service of mutual understanding, that it's attempting to its main goal is really to lay out the awfulness of your opponent's position, to make bare the awfulness of your opponent's position. Its main goal is not to understand what your opponent's position actually is. Now, the thing about, and I alluded to this before, the problem inherent in paraphrasing people in order to see if you understand them and then refining until you actually do understand them so that you can then both be talking about the same thing is it takes a long time. If two people are very, very close, very, very close in terms of their background, their philosophy, their understanding and so on, they'll tend to use words in similar ways. They'll tend to have an easy time being intelligible to each other. So, for example, my friend Eve Kanainen, who's, she's a philosophy professor. She studied a lot of Greek philosophy, as I have. She's an Orthodox Christian, whereas I'm Catholic, but the amount of overlap is incredible there. And especially you can see both churches have valid sacraments, both have valid apostolic succession and so on. And it's not clear there are any doctrinal disagreements. So without getting any further into that, there's a tremendous amount of we have in common. So one thing, if as we're talking, we ever disagree, usually stop, back up a little bit, just make sure of our definitions. And then, typically speaking, where we disagree, we'll often find, you're using this word to mean this, whereas I thought you meant this other thing. And we can resolve this very quickly because we have so much in common and can then, sort of just retreat to the common ground and figure out where we differ. And, we don't agree about literally everything. There are things about which we disagree, but we can also figure out what our disagreement actually is, again, very quickly because we have so much common ground. The problem that people who don't have that massive amount of common ground have is that the amount you have to back up often goes very far. The amount of disagreement, like the things that you disagree about, the ways that you use words differently can be quite substantial, so that you have to keep on going back until you find some words that you're actually using in the same way, and then define the words you're using differently in terms of those words you do both use the same way, and then you can proceed from there to understand each other. It's very, very time consuming. When you have people like a modern materialist or naturalist atheist talking with a classically educated Christian, somebody who's studied Greek philosophy and intermediate Christian philosophy and so on, the amount of difference is so enormous that getting to some common understanding of terms when discussing anything other than is it raining today is huge. It's very, very time consuming. And a lot of people don't have enough of a love for intricate conversation to go through all of that. So it can get very, very tiring to people, especially people who have no background in philosophy. This is one reason why people with a background in philosophy and people without a background in philosophy often have so much trouble talking with each other. They go about just the process of communicating differently because the person with the background in philosophy is always trying to make sure you understand terms. And like anything, it's a skill that takes time to develop in the same way that you don't lift heavy objects without a lot of lifting lighter objects first. When you get used to defining terms, you get better at it, and you get used to just the work involved in defining terms. People who don't spend a lot of time defining terms aren't used to the work, and so the same amount of actual effort involved feels like a lot more work, in the same way that an object of a fixed mass feels heavier to somebody who's got weaker muscles, where somebody with stronger muscles, it feels lighter to because they're just more able to do it. So one problem you run into here, where paraphrasing is being done in good faith, is that, so as a tip for anyone trying to do this, if you're not talking with somebody who studied a lot of philosophy, I strongly recommend really emphasizing the purpose of this is to ensure understanding. When I do it with people who've got no philosophical background in conversation, I find I have to do a fair amount of apologizing. I'm sorry, I just need to make sure before we go on that I actually understand what you mean. When you say this, are you talking about? And that explanation right there helps to explain why this is going on. Why are we taking yet another break? And, it's also very helpful to, shoulder the blame. To say, like, I may be misunderstanding you. So we have, and just, if you don't mind, can we back up for a second to make sure I actually know what you mean here? Makes the person feel a lot better and helps them to be a lot more patient with the process. And if you do this, sometimes you have to pick things up over again, because, you have to be aware that, like, 35 definitions can be a lot for some people. If you're used to doing 100 definitions within a long conversation, it's not that much. But if you're used to more ordinary conversations, 5 definitions within a conversation can actually feel like a lot. It can also make a person feel like they're not getting anywhere. So again, to help a person there, it can be very useful to then recap what we've done so far. As in, like, okay, so now that we've gotten that straight and I understand what you mean, so, we've gotten this far, we've said these things and agree, so that's actually, now I follow you up to here. And little things like that, like reminding a person, like, okay, now I've understood these things that you've said, helps to show the good faith that you're attempting to understand them, that you're attempting to, that this work is in service of trying to understand them, because it's showing that their time is actually valuable, because you're at least trying to know what they mean, rather than disregard it. Also, that sneaks in the putting the thing into your own words, and then the person does have the option to say no, but if they hear you saying the same thing they said in your own words, they'll also feel a lot better, like, okay, you actually got it, because, you can say, oh, I understand all day long. When you put it in their own words, people intuitively know, okay, you know what I meant. Even if you don't agree, the mere fact that somebody else knows what you mean is actually kind of refreshing in this world. Even if you're not used to thinking that people misunderstand each other all the time, as they do. So, there's one other thing that strikes me as one of the big reasons that this can be very trying for people who aren't used to it. And you can see this in the dialogues of Socrates, where people, basically, the thing is, there are a lot of people who don't really know what they mean. And they get really, really angry at you when you essentially point this out to them. Now, Socrates really did this in the dialogues very, very blatantly, where he'd say, okay, what's the answer to this question? Somebody would confidently give an answer. He'd say, okay, let's look at this answer now. And then he'd walk them through to some contradiction or obvious, ludicrous result or something like that, and say, well, your answer can't really have been correct then, can it? And the person would say, no, so clearly that's not really, the right answer, or sometimes not what I meant, or so on. This is really, really tricky in a conversation, because there's a good chance you're introducing cognitive, you're bringing the person face to face with the cognitive dissonance that they have if you show them like this. There's a good chance they're going to think you're trying to trick them. It's unpleasant. You just led them to something that's unpleasant. So whether it's good for them or bad for them or anything else, you led them to it, and you didn't tell them ahead of time. Like if you're giving somebody a shot, flu season, a flu shot, that the person giving you the flu shot is going to give you a flu shot. So you're kind of prepared for it. Here, when you show somebody, when you define your term, when you're asking for clarification enough that it becomes obvious that the person's contradicting themselves, they didn't know they were in for this, and suddenly they're in this very unpleasant place. What's more, if they're not in the habit of figuring out what they mean to this level of clarity, there's a good chance they're going to forget. They're going to remember that talking to you was unpleasant. They're going to remember that talking to you led to them saying something that doesn't make sense. They're not going to remember that really they were the ones who walked there under their own power. You were just asking them questions which led them to take it. So they'll think... So it's common, I've seen this in conversations I've been in with people, where I'm just asking them clarificational questions that they've never asked themselves, and then once they lead themselves into a contradiction, they think that, like, I manipulated them. Because, in fairness, they would not have said this thing were it not for me asking the question. This really, the big thing here is you need to handle, treat people with tact and treat people with a great deal of kindness. So if you're coming up to this sort of thing, it's a really, really, really good idea to stop when it's obvious even to the person where you're going, but not to actually make them say it. This is related to the way that the best way to guarantee you will not win an argument is to try to make the other person admit that you were right. If you walk a person up to where they now know what if you walk a person up to the point where the conclusion's obvious, then stop before they have to admit what the conclusion is. Let them think about it on their own. There is a reasonable chance that at least with reasonable people, they will think about this on their own. They'll get used to it because it takes time to get used to new ideas. And then at some point, they may come back and be explaining this to you and forget that you were the one who actually explained it to them in the first place. And this kind of gets to something that Ronald Reagan's famous for quoting, which is, there's no limit to what a man can do as long as he doesn't care who gets the credit for it. As long as you don't need the credit for having convinced somebody of something, you can convince people of things. If you need the credit, if you have to make them say uncle, there's a really good chance they're going to dig in their heels, they're going to reject everything, and so on. So when it comes to this sort of thing, when you're asking clarificational questions and it's clear that basically you're walking somebody into a contradiction in their beliefs, stop before you make them, you're at the point where they have to either say, no, we're not doing this conversation, or, wow, I'm just massively wrong. Because between those two, they'll almost certainly say, like, no, I'm done with this conversation. And then blame you for manipulating them. If you stop before then, there's a much better chance that they will then think things through again on their own and have time to get used to this, where they don't have to make a decision. It's forcing a decision point that really can wreck conversations and make people just refuse to think through their own ideas. So that's always a danger in these sorts of conversations. If you are clarifying things and you're walking up to a contradiction, it's probably a very good idea. Walk up to a round where it's pretty clear where things are going and stop there. Pushing it past there is likely to just generate bad feelings and make the conversation, destroy all the value there was in the conversation. Human beings are fallen and imperfect, and one of the things about conversing with people is you need a good sense of when to stop. When you're having conversations with people with whom you disagree, one of the most critical things is to develop a good sense of when to stop. Relatedly, to develop a good sense of saying, like, okay, that's what you think to be the case. Good to know what you think is true. I understand. You don't need to. Socially, there's the politeness of where everyone's supposed to agree with each other all the time. There are a lot of things that fulfill that function of politeness, that take up the space that you need to fill in order to be polite without committing yourself to anything. So thank you for explaining that to me. Takes up the, I see that you're right, space in politeness or etiquette without actually saying that you agree to anything. This is where hyperskepticism can also be very useful, as in hyperskepticism is in the anything is possible type of hyperskepticism. It's an interesting idea. I'll need to think about that more. Even though, for something that's obviously wrong. Well, if it's really completely obviously no wiggle room, whatever, wrong, then, you tend to need to be really non-committal in order to still be honest. But you can still be honest and polite with things like well, thank you for explaining this to me. I appreciate you taking the time. And, that ideally will be true, that you appreciate a person giving you time to explain their thoughts to you. It took time from their lives. They have a finite supply of it. So, it was an act of kindness on their part to give some of it to you. So that's an entirely honest thing to say, which makes no claims whatsoever about the thing they said having been worthwhile, just their time was, which is. So you're completely honest and polite there. If you're dealing with somebody who is themselves very rude and desperately needy, where they'll demand that you then say, do you admit that I'm correct? At some point you have to say, this doesn't look right to me. give me some time to think about this and maybe I'll see it in a different light. This is the sort of hyper-skepticism that I'm referring to. Right now I just don't see it. And by and large, people will tend to accept that. Like, that fulfills the responsibilities of interpersonal etiquette without being in the least dishonest. There's nothing wrong with being, with expressing a certain amount of hyperskepticism of, it's not logically impossible that I could be catastrophically wrong about just about, everything. So, give me some time and, it's not completely impossible that I will change my mind. You don't have to think it's likely, or even within the ordinary realm of possible, you can just express within the sort of logical realm of possible. And that suffices. So that etiquette part is, I think, though it may sound a little trivial, it's actually very useful in practice, because a lot of people get led into problems by meaning well and then realizing that, like, oh no, etiquette requires something, and then they go wrong there, either having to dig in their heels or feeling like etiquette requires them to lie, but they can't lie about it. And so that's why knowing how to exit conversations in a fully polite manner is actually a really, really, really important part of the tool set of having conversations, because it keeps you from getting into all sorts of problems where, by not having figured out the etiquette portion of it, you then have screw things up. Either by, telling lies or by being antagonistic in the avoidance of telling lies. So that's why I bring it up. It's actually a very practical tool, because human beings, especially if you're having a face-to-face conversation, you want to not devolve into a fist fight, because you're having a philosophical conversation. And so the verbal tools called etiquette for how you end conversations without starting fist fights is actually really, really handy in this sort of thing, because not every conversation should keep going. Lots of them should stop, make a little bit of progress today, take it up again tomorrow. People's thoughts may well change by tomorrow. You made some progress. Don't try to make all your progress in one big push. Very, very, very useful tools for having actually productive conversations with people, because they may need time to come to fully understand what you said in order for you to even build on the idea. So if you try to build on an idea you introduced today, 10 minutes later, it may be unintelligible. Whereas if you try again tomorrow, introduce the idea today, then introduce the next step that builds on it tomorrow, things may well be more productive. So assuming the goal is actually productive conversations, knowing when to stop is very, very critical. So wrapping it all up, just to briefly recount, is the value of paraphrasing is that because you're putting things in your own words, it will make misunderstandings much, much clearer. It becomes very valuable to work through these misunderstandings until everyone's on the same page, because this often fills in assumptions or underlying, arguments being referenced and other things like that. Background material that you may not have in common now becomes in common, enabling far more productive conversations. You have to be careful, because if people aren't used to doing this much sort of mental heavy lifting, they may well tire of it quickly. So you have to be sensitive to how much is good, and also, for anyone who isn't just used to doing this as a matter of course, help to remind them of the value to them in this in a, polite way, and help to remind them that you're not just trying to grind them down with lots of work, but rather this is all in service of understanding them, because they actually matter to you. And finally, be very wary of, when you're doing this with people who have contradictions within their worldviews, that it's really easy as you're doing this to go to some pretty unpleasant places. So be very wary as you're doing this, and be especially careful to only do one day's work per day. Don't try to do several days' work per day, because sometimes the amount of work you can do per day is in terms of conversation and sharing of ideas, is very small. Also be very, and sort of just related to that, also be very sensitive that you may need to go and explain a lot of related things before your point makes any sense. So, checking to see how much is really understood is valuable there too. And again, everything about, take your time applies. So, and then finally, the one thing that is paraphrasing gone wrong is antagonistic paraphrasing, where the goal of the paraphrase is to try to lay bare somebody's point so that you can attack it. That's not a good goal of paraphrasing. It's It can be a good goal in the context of a debate, like a scored debate where the point is to win. If you're in essentially what amounts to verbal martial arts, then, hey, have at it. Because, the point is to just, hit a person repeatedly until they can't stand anymore in a metaphorical sort of sense. In that sort of verbal dueling. So if that's what you're about, then hey, whatever. All of my comments are related to conversations which are supposed to be productive of mutual understanding. But in that sort of context, paraphrasing should never be used to try to lay somebody's point bare so that you can attack it. That's a misuse of paraphrasing for the purposes of understanding. And until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.